Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about a review title I received from Space Horse Studios, namely their game Boss Crushers, a roguelite arena battler that you can drag your friends through. Find out if I think this bit of boss battering is a bash or basically a bust. So, gonna say there's not really a whole lot to describe here in a narrative sense. There's portals to enter and bosses to kill. That's about it. I mean, there is an almanac you can read through if you want some flavor related to the enemies you're immolating and the items you're acquiring, but that's the long and short of it. Though, as an aside, at least one of the devs definitely has a fondness for Cthulhu, given there's Hastur in the game as a boss, as well as a number of references to Dagon, so I mean, that's a thing. But if it's lacking in story, that does mean that leaves the burden of weight on the game's mechanics. And I do have quite a lot to say about them, especially how these views adapted over time as I gained more insight into the game and how its systems worked. Or didn't. At first, it was sort of charming, a fantasy-flavored arena-based run-and gun that has you mastering a relatively limited set of abilities, which are in turn tied to a relatively limited set of characters. As you kill enemies, you level up, and therefore gain access to one of 3 randomly selected stat perks, which are your main source of strength, aside from tomes, which can typically provide additional spells, potions, which provide temporary buffs, and scrolls, which, well, you don't generally know what they do until you use them, but we're going to touch on that a bit more later. Honestly, it's a pretty simple recipe, and one that you think would work fairly well alongside another player, since the game's co-op has you generate drops separately, so you aren't fighting with each other over who gets what. Unfortunately, the game's problem is less with concept and more with the delivery of these things. First off, the game's a bit janky. For a game which relies on you accurately firing away at enemies, it can be fairly off-putting when your attacks will clip through an enemy's hitbox and do no damage. It's worse when your character model ends up clipping through the floor and you end up in a weird looping bunny hop animation that leads to endlessly falling and then teleporting back up over and over again. It's made even worse by the fact that since there's no fix if this happens, you are obligated to quit, and the game doesn't allow you to resume a run, and you don't even get to salvage any form of account experience to advance your profile, more or less throwing out all the time you invested. Oh, and this is aggravated even further by the complete inability to return to the title screen in case of these issues, since you actually have to completely close out of the game. And that's sort of an important thing here, because the game does ask that you invest a lot of time into it. And by and large, that's due to the fact that the game's enemy scaling is, in dire need of rebalancing. See, every time you clear one of the game's stages, those portals that you can enter, which you can enter in any order you want, it increases the difficulty of the overall session, amping up the remaining portals and their inhabitants by cranking the damage and health of all the enemies you encounter, to a fairly considerable degree as you move forward, and made especially noticeable by the bosses. To the point that you can go from annihilating the first boss you encounter in less than 20 seconds, to taking several minutes for the second boss, and then possibly closer to 10 minutes if RNG has decided it hates you today for the third boss and what comes afterwards. Given the randomized perk system in the game, it's not even an uncommon situation to never have an offensive perk crop up during the run, or one that really benefits high-level gameplay, and therefore be stuck at base damage or close to it because I simply didn't receive any other avenues for gaining in strength, causing fights to rapidly degenerate into several minute-long slogs even with normal enemies. Oh, and the scrolls I mentioned, one of the various avenues that you can technically gain strength from, they can also completely cripple and effectively end runs, given they can do things like deal enough damage to kill you off the hop, make you drop your money, permanently decrease your stats, or level you down by just straight up removing perks. Oh, and also, they can make you forget basic abilities like dodging or your secondary abilities, which can be essentially the end of a run right there and then. Considering you don't get to know what scrolls do unless you luck out and receive a starting perk that allows you to read them or use those scrolls, and a certain potion causes scrolls to affect you twice, it's actually entirely possible to remove the equivalent of 4 levels from yourself instantaneously and completely neuter yourself near the end of the game. Like, I've put a lot of time into this game trying to see the ending, or just to find out if there was a way to get more control over the system. And what I've instead uncovered is that there's a very distinct lack of agency in the choices you're offered. From the get-go, once you unlocked more than a handful of characters you start with, you lose the ability to choose to play as the characters you want, and are instead left with a random selection. Which is a shame, since one of the characters, the druid who comes with a cuddly pet bear, is absolutely underwhelming and a complete trash fire compared to the rest, and even the rest hardly feel equivalent in their overall utility and strength when they're lined up next to each other. But it hardly stops there, since it in turn is made even more random by the starting perks they have at their disposal, which are also randomly selected for you because of course. Considering these range from game changers, such as the ability to know what scrolls do before using them, or permanently gaining damage as you use consumable potions, which is amazing, to more lackluster options like just having a lump sum of more health or bonus damage as long as you're not getting hit by attacks, and which is capped rather low, these can end up ultimately making a very large difference in just how viable your run is going to be from the get-go. And you only have a very limited number of times you can re-roll the character pool before you have to bite the bullet and commit ritual Sudoku. It's absolutely insufferable. And yet, Boss Crusher still manages to astound by finding other elements to trip over. Like a lack of a pause option, even in single player. I'm not sure what that's about, but there it is. I guess it's just the same logic for the reason why you can't actually exit to the start screen. Yeah, they wouldn't just let us restart runs in a leisurely manner. Oh, also, there's this distinct lack of clarity which it manages to refine for just how things work. Both for certain items that you can acquire that provide nebulous bonuses and penalties, to more character-centric things. Remember that druid character I mentioned? Apparently, his bear becomes more powerful the more health you have. But, honestly, his Earthsign Party Crasher has this bad habit of spending most rooms sleeping off some beating-induced exhaustion, regardless of what my health was. Without the game providing some sort of idea as to the bear's scaling, I never really got to find out how much health I'd have to gain to make him significantly useful, or if he was always going to be useless. I'm genuinely guessing the latter, since I didn't really find the bear to be all that survivable even when I had 1,200 health, which is a ridiculous amount for this game. Oh, there's also the secret levels to explore, but honestly, whatever issues I have with the game's scaling, these segments take it up to 11, thrusting you against enemies who are scaled to 2 areas above your current one, meaning they'll just frequently demolish you in a pair of hits if you're unlucky, and take an absolutely astounding amount of punishment before keeling over. Oh, and again, this makes for an absolutely quality moment for you to read a scroll in desperation to be able to hurt the enemies you're facing off, because you've got no offensive abilities, only for the game to erase your ability to dodge and maybe even one of your special attacks. Also, honestly, the bonus areas introduce some of the most annoying enemies period, which they might have been bearable if they weren't scaled up to be walking meat sponges, but making bullet sponges that can also become phase-walking murder machines completely invulnerable bullets for over half the time you're fighting them strikes me as completely malicious bullshit. But, you know, it's not all bad. I can actually say that despite all this, I do enjoy the game's music, and the voice acting for the characters. There's actually voice lines for different characters interacting with each other, some of which are even, like, memey and fun. It just doesn't make up for the rest of this. And I do mean the rest of this, since I have gripes, even for the graphics section, and I almost never have gripes for the graphics. But here we are! Boss Crushers decided to moonlight as a ball buster by providing me with the joy of enemies whose graphics just don't load. providing such wonders as invisible enemies, which I've mostly encountered this in the Forge area, but it's still honestly completely awful to contend with, as are the enemies whose health bars don't load, since that makes prioritizing who to softly pelt with bullets a bit aggravating. I mean, I like the art style, the character designs can be pretty fun, and I genuinely appreciated the enemy and boss design, but yeah, there's distinct faults. Oh, and to clarify, the murder hobo spiders in the final and side areas are supposed to disappear, so if they just homicide you out of the blue, that is in fact the game working as intended. So yeah, I think I've mentioned this in past, I probably have, but I tend to go out of my way to clear games before I write a review, or at least to get as absolutely far as I can. I like seeing the story through, and immersing myself with its mechanics, to make sure that I'm provided as solid a look at the guts of the game before passing judgment over it. And as it stands, I am currently at 20 hours in Boss Crushers, and I find myself regretting that investment of time. Not because I haven't beaten it, which I haven't. I mean, I have on easy, but that doesn't count because you don't get to unlock the final true end of the game unless you're on normal or higher. So I have not beaten the game on normal. I have beaten on easy, but that doesn't count. Anyways, so, you know, not because I haven't beaten it, but because it hasn't really gotten better. In fact, it's progressively felt more and more like the gaming equivalent of smacking my forehead against a wall and expecting the wall to give way before my skull caves in. Each new hour invested has dulled down what enjoyment I got out of it, becoming this repetitive chore as I tried to gain minute passive bonuses, so I could try and perhaps brute my way through the later stages. Because as much as the game calls itself Boss Crushers, it doesn't actually provide fights that are all that interesting. Sure, some of the bosses and their patterns do become more complex, elaborate, and even enjoyable in and of themselves, but the majority of the difficulty comes from just making everything up to its second cousin a complete bullet sponge capable of ruining your day in a sparse few hits. Oh, and did I mention there's a cooldown on your dodge, and some absolutely hectic sequences which positively spam bullets, obstacles, and homing bullets at you in the latter segments of the game? Because that's a thing. Which is why I ultimately rate Boss Crushers as a fail. It fails. It is a fail. At the end of the day, it's just not all that fun in the long run. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, and honestly, it just feels more like an unbalanced demo than a polished final product. Just breathe deep. Okay, so that's a wrap. I'd like to thank you folks, first off, for just tuning in and sticking till the end of this more than the normal frustrated episode. Whether you agree with my thoughts, disagree with them, or just have suggestions about a game you'd like to see me review, or suggestions for the channel itself, I'd love to hear from you folks in the comments. And for those interested in more indie reviews, interviews with developers, or the tabletop content that we've been running on Mondays, feel free to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you get notified when we have new releases. You can also join our Discord, click the link in the banner of the description, so you can become a part of our community. It's pretty nice there, genuinely. Lastly, if you'd like to help support the channel, we do have a coffee running now to help supplement funds for a lovely editor. I'm looking at you, Shrimp. I haven't forgotten about you. And, you know, to make sure that we can continue to provide quality content. Again, check the description and the banner for them links. Anywho, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.